All right, so this is the second video as we kind of work through the different topics in history for the AP Euro exam. We're going to talk mostly about the age of exploration in this period, a little bit about state building and growth of European nation states, even though, I mean, we're kind of using that term loosely because that really doesn't grow to a considerable extent until really the 1600s and even into the 1700s. So it's mostly going to be about the age of discovery, age of exploration. We'll talk a little bit about the growth of states and new monarchs here a little bit too. All right, so really quickly, I just wanted to start today with this lecture with just some broad overview, okay? So one of the things that I think it's really important to point out is like the age of exploration as a product of its time, because I think that this really lends itself to um, and I mean, this could be like a Renaissance, like this could be an effects of the Renaissance question. This could be an effects of the Reformation question. It could be causes of the age of exploration and needing to basically connect this. But like, essentially, I guess what you need to understand is that like the age of exploration, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and this new monarchs and this price revolution, early commercial revolution, are all going to essentially have a relationship together. Okay, so that if you got a question about um, political or economic effects of the Renaissance, for example, like the age of exploration is a good answer there. Okay, and obviously you need to be more specific than that, and how the Renaissance and increased knowledge creates better technology, and this better technology, like for example, the caravels, like better boats and sails. Talk about better map making. So in the 1500s, they mapped the globe. Um, there's all kinds of examples there. I mean, then you could talk about in the same respect. You could talk about the Reformation and how like, well, maybe part of this later periods of exploration and colonization have to do with Spanish desires to re-Catholicize and part of the Jesuit mission work, or yeah, so understanding that like these things are all going to be really connected, and today we'll talk about the new monarchs, so I'm going to mention it here, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. I think the other thing that I really want to kind of express at this point is that College Board, often asked you to compare and contrast old imperialism, which is this like early exploration period we're going to talk about today, and this sort of new imperialism, which is the conquest of Africa and Asia in the 1800s. The whole race for Africa, Berlin Conference in 1884. This old imperialism is really most prominently characterized by the exploitation of resources through like establishing forts and ports on coastal areas. And so like the Europeans would go to different areas in the world, establish ports and forts along with them, establish trade relationships with these. But in most cases, you're not really talking about like full conquest of these areas. I guess the only real exception is the Spanish. And so like the Spanish imperialism in the 1500s mirrors more of this like new imperialism, where you're going to go in, you're going to completely control the country, you're going to set up like a full colony, etc. So, um, and I think what characterizes most of this like exploration is like the need for resources, and so like that kind of explains um, like Portuguese and Dutch and even early English and French exploration. Now the English eventually are going to start colonizing, um, but like most of this early exploration is different in the sense that like um, it, it is, I mean, the resources that they're going to want are different, but the level of control is different too in most cases. I mean, it's the Spanish being the exception there, okay? So I would kind of keep that in the back of your head as you listen here, is how these things kind of compare and contrast to the sort of second wave of exploration and colonization that happens in the 1800s, largely as a result of industrialization, a need for new markets, new resources, as like the Industrial Revolution, both the first Industrial Revolution and the second Industrial Revolution really take off. All right, so again, this PowerPoint kind of goes along the same lines, so social, political, religious, etc. So social components of this age of exploration that you'd want to be aware of and be conversant with. So the age of exploration, one of the biggest components of this is the Columbian Exchange. Understand that like the Columbian Exchange and the introduction of potatoes and corn into Europe, it's going to have a huge effect on improving diets. Okay, people are going to be healthier, and potatoes probably the most important one there. Okay, so people are going to be healthier because potatoes are, we've talked about this a bunch, super easy to grow, much more like calorie dense and much more nutritious than just eating loaves of bread and crappy soup like that old most peasants would have been eating. So the introduction of potatoes, now that's going to be slow. Okay, so I don't want to like overstate this. Like Columbus comes back in the 1490s and suddenly everyone's got potatoes. No, that doesn't happen. Okay, so potatoes are going to be introduced to different parts of Europe over a long period of time, but they do improve diets. Okay, so and then better diets mean healthier people, mean people live longer, people are healthier, etc. All right, you are also going to see obviously slavery being a big social change here. So not only slavery had I don't think it's appropriate to call like the serfdom slavery because it was different. But like so African slavery and then racialized slavery is going to be a huge problem in the Americas. The Portuguese are really the first ones that start shipping slaves from the west coast of Africa over to Portugal, mostly to grow sugar. And then obviously that's going to continue with the Spanish bringing slaves over to the Caribbean and for sugar as well. Other social factors, we're going to talk about the price revolution. That has, and the commercial revolution has its own whole slide on this, so I'm not going to deep dive into that. But I mean, the biggest sort of social changes is you're going to have the growth of a very, very small middle class. Now, depending on the country, that's going to differ. So like the Dutch had a sort of moderate middle class. Eventually, that really doesn't happen until like the 1600s. But like England, for example, once England starts exploring and colonizing, like the growth of the English middle class is going to happen in the 1600s too. So, that's going to this age of exploration is going to have social effects. And I think the other sort of social thing is that like with the opportunity to have different materials, wealthy people over Europe become much more materialistic. And I think like that's not only the effect of having more resources available to them and unique resources available to them, so like French and the furs. I also think like the much more widespread use of silk is another good example of that. But it's also like an effect of humanism, so they're kind of working in tandem here, right? When people start being like more wealthy people are humanists, they start to believe that they to live a good life they need materials and materialistic, and they want to live a good life and life matters, etc. All right, so politically speaking, Portugal is going to kind of lead the way in this exploration down the coast of Africa. Henry the Navigator starts a navigation school in Portugal in this time. And so he is going to continue to push exploration down the coast of Africa. And really what he's looking for is he's trying to find gold on the west coast of Africa. And so the Portuguese are really the first ones that map essentially the route along the western coast of Africa. Bartholomew Diaz is the first Portuguese explorer that finds the Cape of Good Hope, which is like the southernmost tip of Africa. And then Vasco da Gama is the first Portuguese explorer that makes it all the way to India. And this is important to note here that this has huge political effects all over Europe. Okay, so when da Gama completes the route to India in the 1490s, this essentially lines up well with like the downfall or the start of the downfall of the Italian monopoly of sort of this Renaissance period, right? So as the Portuguese first, and then the sort of Spanish and Dutch and English later are all going to find ways to basically circumvent the Italian monopoly on control of access to Eastern goods and resources. And so this is really important. I mean, even like when we talk about like what allows the Portuguese to sail all the way to India, you could talk about like the invention of the caravel. So they use um, different shapes of sails, which allowed them, and the design of the boats allowed them to sail into the wind and not just downwind. And so, like, there's also elements of the Renaissance here in technological improvements as well. Uh, so the Portuguese had better boats. They had better and more heavily armed boats. Like another invention was the mounted cannon that they started putting in Portuguese boats. Um, and so during the same period, remember, and this is easy to remember, so 1492. So during this exact same period is Columbus decided he was going to sail, instead of going all the way down and around Africa, because they realized how long of a route that was. Columbus decided that he was going to sail west and get to India. And so, um, Columbus thinks that he ends up just landing in Hispaniola. He thinks that he's in India or some islands off of India. But the Spanish are different because of this the initial desire is the same, right? Find a route to India, get access to spices and pepper, silk, and other goods of the East. But the Spanish are different in the sense that once they find this new land, um, they go about conquering it and occupying it. So whereas like the Portuguese set up trade ports and routes all over the coast of Africa and then along the coast of India, they don't really control land like the Spanish do. So the Spanish, when they land in these new colonies, are going to send conquistadors and basically conquer these existing um, empires that are there. So like Cortez is going to wipe out the Aztecs in Mexico, and then Pizarro is going to basically kill the Incas in Peru and Chile. And so like that's one of these like the Spanish were much more like later colonization that happens, um, as opposed to like what's going to happen with this sort of initial age of exploration. This is also really big, and I've already kind of mentioned this, but like there's a huge shift in power that's going to happen in Europe and just sort of broadly in the world. So during the Middle Ages and this early Renaissance period, is that the Ottomans and Italians are going to be some of the richest empires in the world because they controlled the trade and networks in the world at that point. Now, the power is going to shift from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic seacoast because, like Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain are going to have um, access not only to be able to go around Africa and have a direct access to India more efficiently, but they're also going to have access to go across the Atlantic and get to the New World once they start doing that more. Um, Religiously, so, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So remember, like the impulses or causes of this age of exploration are easy to remember. Just as simply put, like God, glory, and gold. Okay, so gold is kind of a shorthand for resources and riches, whether that's actually gold or it's silver or it's pepper or silk, whatever it is. Um, the second component of that is God, though. So one of and I think that it's probably better to understand the God part of this age of exploration more as like a justification for what they're doing than really like a true cause of what they're doing. So I think like the political and economic causes of the age of exploration are like the two factors that are most causing these countries to increase exploration, increase trade route, and economic activity within parts of the world. But to say that religion's not a factor of it would be wrong. So there is a desire, obviously, to spread Catholicism and to be a part of their exploring. They wanted to convert these, heathens in different parts of the world to be Catholics. I think then, especially after the Reformation starts to spread in Europe, I think there's also this, and I think this is probably most strongly felt by like in Spanish colonization, but there is and in the Jesuits, but there is also like a reaction then to this Reformation. In part, like the Jesuits were part of the Counter Reformation, and they wanted to create missions all over the world where they could educate and Catholicize people and grow and strengthen the Catholic Church. Um, I mean, even like in America, like we see, like the Catholics were the ones that set up missions all along like the West Coast, for example, um, San Diego, Los Angeles, like places that are now California, um, would have started out as um, missions, Spanish missions. So I think that's a good example of how like religion plays a part in this. But just kind of keeping in the back of mind, I think that's more of a justification for what they were doing, and the economic and political exploitation there, than really probably this like a true strong motivator. Intellectualism, as far as it or intellectual changes as they relate to the age of exploration, we've already talked a lot about the effect of the Renaissance here, and that kind of plays into this whole like God, gold, and glory. Um, these explorers really wanted to be famous, so especially as like the printing press is developed in the 1450s, and people start writing more stories, and stories are getting printed, and they're getting printed in vernacular, so more people are reading them. um, I think there's a small element of this that like the Columbuses and Magellans and um, like the Marigo Vespucci's of the world, like they wanted to be famous, and they wanted stories to be told of them, and so like there's this individualism, this curiosity that's gonna, and this sort of desire for glory, and I think that also plays into humanism there, where it's like, um, if your life doesn't really matter, it doesn't really matter if you're famous or like people write stories about you, but if you start to believe that life is important and what you do here on this earth is important, then like, well, that becomes a big deal. And so I think that those things are related. Um, Also, this age of exploration is really going to, in the Renaissance, is also going to really help spur the scientific revolution. So a lot of the improvements in exploration, in map making, are going to have to do with cartography, understanding latitude and longitude, and those initially are going to, well, and even to the to further along, they're going to start with watching stars. So, um, like these early, like the astrolabe, for example, which like help chart like where like latitude lines, um, like this scientific revolution, age of exploration, are all going to kind of be in tandem with like the scientific revolution and improvements and inventions as the university systems spread as a result of the Renaissance. Okay, so these things are all kind of related. Talking specifically about some of those new technologies, so you have navigational devices that help people figure out where they are, like the magnetic compass, which I think actually was invented in the 1300s. But the astrolabe was, I think, 14 something. Um, but even better, like map making. So I think the first world map was made in like the early 1500s, and then uh, like the projection maps. So like the ones where they tried to scale it, like the Mercator map, I think was like mid 1500s. So like even cartography is going to really improve, which is going to help people um, keep better track of where they're at. I also like would put banking in here, and I know that is maybe not necessarily the greatest connection or strongest connection to the age of exploration, uh, but understand that like the the banking techniques of the Medici's, of the Fuggers, are going to help um, these new monarchs like create and keep better track of like massive amounts of wealth. So as money pours in, they're able, like banking is going to both improve as a result of the age of exploration, but also then like help funnel it initially. Um, we see the creation of joint stock companies, what are essentially like early corporations, where a bunch of people are going to pool their money together and fund explorations in hopes of making it rich. Again, so not only shows like early capitalism, um, but also shows humanism, and they're trying to scheme ways to get rich. Uh, and then obviously the printing press, we talked a lot about that already, so I'm kind of jump along. All right, so economics. So I think like the biggest thing here is that they're looking most importantly for pepper, ginger, sugar. Throw in their silk kind of as well, but once the French steal the methods of how to produce silk, that's not as big of a deal. Um, so during this early Renaissance period, remember the Europeans are going to access non-European goods or Eastern goods through the Ottomans and Italians. So prices of these goods are going to be way marked up because the Ottomans get them from different Asian empires. They mark them up when they sell them to the Italians so they can make a profit, and then the Italians mark them up when they sell them to the rest of Europe so they can make a profit. And so the exorbitant price of these goods is going to prevent a lot of these goods from spreading to in any kind of considerable way into Europe. All right, so once the Portuguese and the Spanish start getting access to these goods via direct boat routes, this is going to end this sort of Venetian and Ottoman monopoly of trade, and this has really important effects. Okay, so obviously there's a change in power, and we talked about the political effects, but economically speaking, we're going to see a huge increase in goods into Europe, and they're going to be cheaper. And so like this is going to really have a considerable economic effect where you have more goods and more cheaper goods. And initially this is going to be a really good thing. However, we are going to see some negative effects like this. We talked about this a lot, where like so much gold and silver is actually going to flow into parts of Europe, and this affects the Spanish most significantly. There's going to be so much gold and silver that flows into Europe that it actually caused this massive inflation, which initially, then this is called the price revolution. Initially, this is a bad thing because things become much more expensive because the wide availability and of money, of bullion, because remember, precious metals are mostly used as money at that point. But this price revolution, when the price of goods goes up, it hurts people in the short run, but it ultimately is going to spur commercialism because people realize like, hey, these goods got more expensive again, and we have better access to them. Well, I'm going to create companies, like commercialized companies, and I'm going to enter this commercial market and sell goods and be able to make a living off of that. So like that, and we're going to talk about commercial revolution in a couple slides here. So I'll jump to that when we get there. I think the other sort of big economic effect, and I mean this is going to have social effects as well, is the Columbian Exchange. So there's going to be considerable changes. So like from the Americas, Europe's going to get potatoes, corn, tomatoes, peanuts, tobacco, vanilla, chocolate, eventually coffee, even though they don't necessarily do that right away. So like I think the biggest things that come back to Europe are agricultural products. These are going to help Europeans improve their diets. It's going to help feed a growing population. It's going to make people rich. The biggest thing that Europe gives to Americas obviously is diseases. We talk about like anywhere from 50 to 90% of natives die as a result of like European diseases. But so I think the other biggest thing is just understanding is animals. Okay, so like cows, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, etc. All right, we talked about commercial revolution. So causes of this, we've talked a lot about this, is so there is going to be wealth that is created from these new trade routes that is going to allow people to create businesses. There's going to be more resources available so that they can, more cheap resources available, and at least in some regards. Finished products become more expensive because of the price revolution. There's more people in the economy. There's all these things that are basically making the sort of create the fundamentals, the basic bedrocks of like a commercial economy. You need access to resources. You need consumers that have money to spend. You need these commercial products to be expensive enough for people to make a living selling them. And so like I think all of these are going to basically create the beginnings of this commercial revolution that's going to last all the way through the 1800s, right? So like our full commercial economy really isn't fully developed until the Industrial Revolution, really maybe even the Second Industrial Revolution. So we've already kind of talked about that stuff. I'm just going to leave it at that, okay? All right, so economic changes. I've talked a lot about this. The beginnings of the agricultural revolution happened during this time period, largely as a result of this Columbian exchange. So they get new products from the New World. They try to figure out how they can grow these crops better and in what environments. And I think especially when you talk about like the population in the 1500s is going to grow so rapidly, and then actually in the 1600s it's going to slow down. I mean, if you look at this chart here, the population grows by almost 20 million in 100 years, and then the next 100 years it only grows by 6 million. So there's a huge difference there. And so like what landowners try to do is they try to diversify their products that they're growing, but they also try to become much more efficient with that. And so, and I think a lot of like the 1600s is farmers trying to figure out how to play catch up with like underproducing food in the 1500s as a result of this growing population. So there's some of that both going on there. We could also talk about a military revolution. I know that like if you actually read your book, they kind of question whether this happened or not. I would say that it did, only because I mean I think the if you look at these examples that I give you on the bottom of this slide here, is that if you look at this, there in the 1400s and 1500s, there's a pretty close connection or relation between like the power of the Ottomans and the power of different European countries. By the time that we get to like the mid 1600s, and maybe you could talk about this military revolution really happening like most strongly in the context of a 30 Years' War, but I also think it relates to the Renaissance. It relates to changing states, changes to changing militaries because they're going to be monarch funded. There's all these different changes when there was a scientific revolution. Like Galileo creates like more effective cannonballs, for example, and the telescope was initially used for military purposes, so you could see people from farther distance away. But so if you look at these battles that happened after the 30 Years' War between European powers and the Ottomans, is that European countries had gotten so much better at killing each other that when they fought outsiders, is that the battles were incredibly lopsided. And if you look at that battle in 1697, where there's a battle between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottomans, and where the Holy Roman Empire loses 300 guys and the Ottomans lose 20,000, I mean, that just kind of highlights the huge differences. And even if you kind of go, like, if you look at this here, and we'll kind of continue this on to the next slide, if you just look at, like, the growth of armies or armed forces during this time period, and, I mean, and really specifically the growth from, like, 1590 to, like, these 1670s, I mean, really the only country that doesn't have massive growth in the size of their military is Spain, and because that's best explained by the downfall of the Spanish Golden Age, and how Philip II fights all these religious wars and wastes all of Spain's money, and so like the Spanish Empire is in decline and they can't pay for their military. But if you look at the rest of the countries in Europe, I mean, we see massive growth in armed forces. So if we talk about the new monarchs, so this is just the last kind of slide I'm throwing in here just at the end to kind of wrap up this new monarch things and to kind of review this. So remember the critical components of new monarchs, and I think like you could get questions here where it would say, compare, the new monarchs to absolutists, like what's one similarity, what's one difference, and what's one effect, or what's one cause of the difference. But these new monarchs are essentially going to set the bedrock or foundation for these absolutists. So they're not going to be absolutists. They're not really true nation states to some extent, but they are going to create the foundations for later monarchs to become absolutists. So like they're going to create taxes. I think a really good example of this is like the taille in France, which is going to be a continual feature of states all the way obviously up till today. They're going to create private armies paid for by tax money and the wealth generated by exploration. All rulers do this at this time. Remember, they didn't want to have to rely on the nobles for military support. So historically, the nobles had I mean, that was part of their like obligation to the king was like, hey, if anything goes wrong, we'll give you our armies of peasants to fight. Um, so kings become independent, wealthy. They have independent military power, so they become much stronger. They're also going to remove the highest-ranking nobles, their competition, from important jobs in government and replace them with lower-level nobles. I think the best example of this is the Court of the Star Chamber in England. That's Henry the Eighth that does that. And they kind of create bureaucracy, right? So they want to have people that are loyal to them running the government instead of nobles that could be their competition. Um, and so, like, I think you should be able to see similarities in that between like Louis's level of absolutism, um, with like differences in wealth, differences in control over the economy. Uh, you know, I even think you could talk about like differences in the ability to like. I think one of the differences that show like the difference between like Louis and Peter the Great. Their absolutism, one feature of that is their ability to control religion, for example, which, um, like Elizabeth struggles with, and she creates a sort of a moderate middle path. Like Henry IV has to allow some religious toleration so that like French people aren't just killing each other over different versions of Christianity. So whereas like Peter's going to stamp out different like Christian sects, and Louis XIV is going to end the Edict of Nantes and with the Edict of Fontainebleau and say like everyone's being Catholic and no religious freedom. So I think like there's a good difference um, between the two of them. But that's basically it. So Merry Christmas. Hope that was helpful. Goodbye.